Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Esoteric and what now seems to be a continuing series on Nintendo Switch emulation, legality, and Nintendo lawsuits. And we got a really fun and interesting episode for you guys this evening because a new fork of Yuzu has appeared, and it is called Suyu. That is definitely a tongue-in-cheek joke about Nintendo's actions, but the developers are taking a very novel and interesting approach that basically strips out all the issues Nintendo took with the Yuzu developers in Tropical Haze, and just basically makes a clean room environment as far as the concept is concerned, because obviously I've been following along by now. Nintendo sued Tropical Haze, the parent company of the Yuzu and Citra emulator. They settled that case for $2.4 million, and the developers of Yuzu had to cease and desist all development. But we talked about in a previous video, that is a settlement, not a court judgment. There is no precedent set, which means other emulator developers can take that source code, including the company you see here, Suzu. It's a pretty funny name, but it does seem like it's a serious branch of Yuzu, and they're going to be doing some very interesting things on how to try to keep this legal, which we're going to go over. And just so you're aware, Suzu is not available to download yet. You can compile the source code on their Git repository, but there is no executable you can just grab as of yet. But the most interesting thing is how the team behind Suzu is actually approaching this. In a lot of ways, this seems like a little bit of a whack-a-mole situation, and it seems like developers might be trying to bait Nintendo into seeing what they're going to be doing in the future. Because so much of what Nintendo took issue with Tropical Haze and Yuzu was the leaks of games before Street Date, as well as their Patreon income. There was a lot of issues outside of the actual court case. Seems to be that they had a lot of different screenshots from the Yuzu Discord where things were definitely not being kept above board. So Suzu seems to be doing the exact opposite, and that would lead to a situation where Nintendo would have to bring a clean court case against them to see whether or not actually using your own keys and game codes would be allowable or not. You're going to see that it is built from the Yuzu source code, and the Yuzu source code is open source, but they've done a lot of things, like entirely delete the funding situation out of the emulator. They're not going to be accepting any contributions, Patreon or otherwise. They are just developing these things with a zero-sum gain for themselves. And again, Suyu as an emulator just kind of sounds really funny, and it definitely is a little bit baity. But on the Yuzu side of things, Nintendo did state in their court filing that they thought video game emulators are used for piracy. So this is a very interesting statement to think about. Suzu wants to do the exact same thing that Yuzu did without taking any money, without giving any directions on how to actually obtain your keys. They're creating software and the user has to know how to do the rest. They're still looking into this, they're still planning and organizing, so it's not something that is 100% determined yet. And they have said that they've spoken with someone with legal experience who's not a lawyer, but does have 3 years of law school. I don't know if that would be what I would advise whatsoever. I spent a lot of time dealing with IP and copyright law, and if they came to me and asked my opinion, I would have told them you need to go to a professional lawyer, someone who's passed the bar exam and does deal in these laws on an everyday case-to-case basis. But getting rid of the Patreon, getting rid of the fan funding, takes one leg of Nintendo's argument out that they were being paid to try to circumvent the protections for Nintendo Switch emulation. They've also rebranded everything. Obviously that makes sense. This is not Yuzu anymore either. But the big thing that Nintendo did not like, and we can take a look at the historical stats, was the Yuzu team's Patreon. They were the 11th in the game's rank and 141st overall in Patreon contributions, netting about $30,000 a month. Taking the money was not a good thing for Yuzu, and that is a problem. And you'll see here that they are specifically stating they do not intend to make money or profit from the project. So if Nintendo does decide to sue Suzu, that's a hard sentence to say, they're not going to be able to claim that they're taking money for the effort. They're also been warned against providing step-by-step guides to be able to use your Switch key as well as your game key, and I do think that's a very intelligent thing to do as well. A lot of what Nintendo took issue with was Yuzu teams giving you the directions on how to do all of this. Now this is still not a settled argument, and I do still think it would be found to be legal to give you directions on how to obtain your own Switch keys, but that's something that Nintendo argued about in the lawsuit, so again, the Suzu developers are smart to avoid this entirely. you're going to see that they also state that they do not support or condone piracy in any form. It's a smart statement to make, but honestly, from a legal standpoint, that really isn't going to matter whatsoever. Nintendo will decide whether or not they want to pursue this, and it doesn't matter what the Suzu developers say. That kind of is meaningless. But you'll see here that they're talking about on the Discord that piracy is prohibited all the way down to shader caches, which I think is actually a very smart decision and something that a legal mind has advised them. Nintendo could claim that sharing shader caches is sharing proprietary information because so much of what the APU can do here in the shaders and calls to the actual hardware could be considered protected property. When I did a Citra emulation guide, I talked about how the game would stutter while it caches the shaders and transposes them in emulation. Those little bits of data could be protected, so again, this is a very smart decision on the part of Suzu team. Again, you have to bring your own keys, and that's going to be consistent across the board. No emulator maker would be distributing these, but Nintendo is still claiming that working around this, if you bring your own keys on the hardware and software side, would still be considered circumvention in their mind. Now, this is the argument that I do not think would hold up in court if it actually went before a judge. And I think what's going to happen is if you don't see Nintendo go after Suzu because they haven't taken Patreon money, they haven't talked about piracy on Discord, then I think that's telling that Nintendo also finds that this argument would not be a winner in court, the hardware key and software key rolling your own on both of those aspects. They have a very good legal team in-house, and I'm sure externally as well, and they would have lawyers advising them whether or not they thought this circumvention argument would hold up in court. So I think if you see Nintendo do nothing, that means their lawyers are telling them that they could easily lose this case and set a precedent that Nintendo would not like to have. So in a lot of ways, this new emulator situation feels like it's actually challenging Nintendo to tip their hands, show their cards, and actually describe what they are taking an issue with. Is it the keys, the user providing their own, and do they really think that that's circumvention and want to have a lawsuit on that? Or was this Nintendo suing Yuzu and Tropical Haze because of the Patreon and the clear disregard on Discord and other places for actually running this thing in a clean room style environment? Because Suzu will not be encumbered by all of the issues that Yuzu had. They've never taken any Patreon money. I'm assuming their Discord is clean by this point in time. They've never leaked any games before release date or otherwise. This is removing all of those things that Nintendo took issue with, including the directions on how to obtain your hardware and software keys. So Nintendo would have to bring a suit saying that this new emulator is circumventing their technological protections, and only on that front. They've really done a great job of unencumbering themselves from all of the arguments of Yuzu and Tropical Haze and just getting down to the nitty-gritty of whether or not using a key from your own hardware and your own software is legal or not, and I really don't think that that's a case that Nintendo would like to have. But we do need to remember what I've said in every other video about the golden rule: he who has the gold makes the rules. Nintendo could pursue whoever's making Suzu and sue them and basically just have their lawyers say, we are going to spend you into oblivion before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. That is the big 2,000-pound elephant in the room. But in some ways, this actual article and this emulator feels like maybe there might be somebody behind it that would like to bring it to a court case. That's pure presumption, but this does seem to be basically designed to poke Nintendo and see how they react. They're talking about wanting to get new developers and deal with all of this in a very smart, intelligent way, removing all of the issues Nintendo had with Tropical Haze and Yuzu in the first part. And it does talk about how the shutdown shows how tough it can be to completely kill these projects because they are open source. And like we talked about in the previous video, only a settlement was made. A settlement is not precedent, and that means this settlement will allow, until Nintendo steps in and tries to do otherwise, forks of other software emulators based on this source code. The Yuzu team had to stop producing the emulator, they had to stop working on it, they had to remove their domains, but there's nothing about it that talks about actually taking the source code down. And we, if Nintendo actually sues on the Suzu side and gets to court, are talking about territory where we might actually have a precedent set. But honestly, I don't think Nintendo is going to go after this one unless they make a misstep, because again, it has removed all of the issues Nintendo has had with Tropical Haze. I don't think Nintendo ever cared about a Switch emulator existing. Their hardware and software were selling like hotcakes. They didn't like the fact that it was making money, and they didn't like the fact that they were openly flouting what they were doing on Discord, basically thumbing their nose at Nintendo. But I'm going to keep making these videos as new bits of information come up, because I find this infinitely interesting, and I'm very impressed how many of you do as well. Because obviously software emulation has been with us for a long time, and it's always going to be with us in the future, but I'm very curious to see what Nintendo does on this one. A big thanks to Mr. Sujano for sending me the article. I'll leave a link to his channel below. He's basically the emulation guru of YouTube. But if you have any questions, leave them down below. I'll do another video the next time Nintendo shows up. See you next time. Bye bye.